Good afternoon, everyone. I extend a very warm welcome to everyone who has joined us for this webinar on India's clean energy, a subject that has been a focus area for Mongo Bay India now for several months. With this webinar, we kickstart a series of such webinars for the next few months. We aim that during these webinars, we discuss in detail the challenges and opportunities for the India's clean energy sector. We are aiming to reach out to all stakeholders during these webinars, as it is clear from the stellar cast that we have today. We are hoping that these webinars will be very interesting for journalists, policymakers, entrepreneurs, and anyone interested anyone interested in a deep analysis of the India's clean energy sector. As we start the series today, I just want to emphasize that the focus of these webinars is to understand how India's clean energy sector has progressed over the years. During this first session today, the idea is to discuss in detail how India achieved the 100 gigawatt of installed renewable energy capacity so far. We want to discuss the lessons learned by various stakeholders so far, whether it is the government or the industry. We will also focus on the challenges that the sector has so far, especially when it comes to achieving the 175 gigawatt target by 2022, and as we move towards over 450 gigawatt by 2030. To take this forward, I just give a small introduction to the panelists we have today. We have Mr. Deepak Gupta, who is right now the Director General of the National Solar Energy Federation of India. He's also the former MNRE Secretary, and he was also the chairman of the UPSC at one time. He is in fact credited to have started this energy transition journey of the country. I welcome you, sir. We also have Mr. D.V. Giri with us. He is considered a veteran in the Indian wind power industry, which is a sector considered which is the sector which is considered pioneer in India's clean energy journey. In fact, when nobody was even talking about renewable energy, or very few people were talking or discussing about clean energy in India, wind energy was being led by veterans like Mr. Giri. We welcome you, sir. I also welcome Ms. Apurva Mitra. She, while we talk about industry, we talk about government. She actually represents a sector a stakeholder who has critically analyzed all the twists and turns that Indian industry has taken over the years. And she's right now leading the climate policy for WRI India. And I welcome you, Ms. Mitra. We are hoping to have a fruitful discussion with all of you. And last but not the least, I welcome S. Gopi Krishna Warrior, who likes to call himself a journalist of the Jurassic age. He has an experience of over 35 years covering India's energy issues, starting from Rio, much before Rio, but he has seen this transition from Rio and to now Glasgow. I welcome you all, and I hope this discussion leads us to great points that we have been waiting for to understand on clean energy. For those of you joining us, I would just like to clarify, give a format that each panelist will get 5 to 7 minutes to share their introductory remarks, following which we'll have a small discussion on the issues raised. And then the panelist and then the floor will be open for discussion and questions from the audience. I welcome you all, and first of all, I would like to go to Mr. Gupta and just understand how he has seen over the years India's progress on clean energy. What are the challenges he thinks he has seen, and how he looks at the future now. Over to you, Mr. Gupta.
Okay, thank you very much for inviting me. I think let us look at the future first, and then some of the challenges that we have faced will be embedded in this. And then, of course, specific issues can be discussed in the question and answer session. You have talked of the targets of 2022 and 2030, and everybody actually only mentions those targets. They give us direction and they reflect our ambition of where we want to go. But we should necessarily discuss the entire context of the situation and all the issues related, so that we can have a clearer view of how to reach what could be a roadmap and what could be the challenges. So I would like to concentrate on this larger context and raise certain issues. The first is, I think, for a couple of decades, we have been overestimating demand and therefore rushing to meet the supply. This has resulted in the huge capacity building, whether it is thermal or whether it is various aspects of renewable energy. We would have done it for nuclear energy had that been possible. So today you are seeing actually a historic low PLF around mid 50s or something like that. And you are also seeing in the solar sector, Mr. Giri will tell about the wind, but in the solar sector, you are seeing PPAs are being cancelled, states are not paying money, solar power is being curtailed. You know, it is a lot of problems are being faced. So your supply now is very much over more than the demand. And therefore, when you talk of supply side targets, we have to be very sure that they actually are in sync with the demand. Now, the CEA report there was some months back, which said what could be the optimum mix of energy, electricity. I think that that is also a little bit more ambitious, and also too high on the renewable energy, and they don't talk about the demand so much. So I think it is essential we really estimate our demand correctly. Now, let's briefly about the other things. Coal at the moment, I don't think the world is going to allow India to have new coal plants after 2030. It will be very difficult. So my feeling is that we should maximize the most efficient production of coal in the next few years of coal plants, while we close down the more inefficient coal plants. And with the target of their PLF being 90% or so, and we start thinking of rehabilitation of closed. Now, for the solar sector, we are talking of today we are at about 45 gigawatt. That means we have averaged 6 to 7 gigawatt per year, and this is so for good reasons. And almost 90% of this is based on import. The problem is that we simply don't have the manufacturing capacity. After all, we are nil in ingot and wafer. We have about 2,000 megawatt in cells. We have about 10 gigawatt in modules, and there are many other things where we are short. And therefore, it is my view, and it was always was my view, that in the first instance we should set about having our indigenous manufacturing capacity, and we may require up to 15 gigawatt of ingot, up to 20 gigawatt of wafers, up to 25 gigawatt of cells. But this is not an easy task, and I think this is what we should concentrate upon. Even now there is a PLI scheme, but the PLI scheme will be limited, maximum 10 gigawatt or something. And then as per the domestic capacity development, we should do our deployment. So this is a very important issue that we should discuss. Then come to storage. After all, at the end of the day, you will require 24 by 7 electricity, and so storage will become very important. Now, battery cost is declining and will continue to decline. So I don't think that there should be a great rush for us to go into a large scale battery manufacture at this stage when costs are high. We should do a huge R&D institutional collaborative process in India to have new chemistry for Indian made batteries, and that must deliver within 3 years, and that is what we should develop. So by 2030, yes, we should have some battery storage, but we should be capable of thereafter developing storage capability in a big manner after 2030. So actually 2030, 2020 is the decade of consolidation. Then we talk of green hydrogen. Now there is a lot of talk of green hydrogen. It's a very complex matter. You just can't, there's no magic bullet to start off. It's very costly. There are transportation difficulties. There are storage difficulties, you know. I should not go into a high cost system for hydrogen. And green hydrogen will require solar. And in solar, I'm already having problems. So again, we should first focus on the electrolysis production coming down and manufacturing in India. So we prepare up to 2030. We start on a big program of making trucks which are going to be based on hydrogen fuel cells. and then the highways will have to be, empowered. And my idea has been that we should have solar on the highways. Let us see the design, let us see the costs, so that hydrogen is produced at the consumption point. Now, these are very detailed issues where lot of work has to go on, where we see every geographical situation and find locations to do these things. This is the work which we need to do now. Technologies require changes for steel, etc., hard to abate industrial sectors. Let us focus on the technology during this decade and be ready to take off from 2030, even for green hydrogen. But at the end of the day, solar will provide green hydrogen, solar will provide power batteries, solar will provide batteries for mobility, solar will provide electricity in the daytime, solar will provide electricity in the evening hours also, which means you will require a huge quantity of solar. Yes, so target of 450 that way is only natural. I sometimes argue that by 2040 or 2050, you may be requiring 1,000 gigawatt of solar, which means that I may have to have a capacity to have 30 gigawatt of solar per year. Now the question is, where will I put the solar? I mean, we must sit back and think. There are already a lot of land problems coming up everywhere. Disputes are there. It is not possible to simply say India is such a big landmass and therefore I can produce all the electricity I want by solar. It is not like that. And then know the recent Supreme Court order, which is about the Great Indian Bustard, which most of the effective area of Rajasthan has actually got a body blow from that. Yes, we will have in Ladakh, but transmission from Ladakh is difficult and expensive. So we will go to Ladakh and later on, time is not running away when we can do storage, etc., at the least possible cost in Ladakh. So we have to be very careful and design. Let us have solar parks, identify land for 500 gigawatt now only, and have solar parks. Let us use the decentralized value of solar. Let us first convert all electric pumps into solar pumps, which will also solve the problem of the discoms issues of electricity and tariff, etc., which are huge barriers. uh, will continue to be barriers. It will increase farmers' incomes. Let us have small plants by farmers at the rural side, 1 megawatt, 500 kilowatt, etc., which are connected to the grid. Let us have grid connected villages supplying electricity. This will cause an entrepreneurial and employment revolution in the rural areas while giving us solar at the site of consumption. These are all, externalities which are very positive in nature, and we must consider these. Just not doing solar, but what problems I can resolve by doing solar. So we have to be very careful. Finally, two other things, and you have future of electricity. We have to think not only of supply. How do I reduce demand? I think we are not giving enough emphasis on energy conservation, energy efficiency. Buildings have to be mandated. We tried very hard during our time to have a mandated green buildings. We are just going on making buildings which is raising our air conditioning costs and requirements. I mean, we are waiting for a situation which will go out of control. So whether BIPV can be there, whether solar can come on highways, these are important issues and should be discussed. Nobody discusses them. That is the problem. And finally, let us not only focus on solar and coal and wind, etc. There is a huge area of bioenergy which we are neglecting. I think we must utilize all the possible potential, which is great, whether it is urban waste or sewerage or even the stubble, which is in Punjab. I can convert it into compressed biogas. Huge opportunities exist. We simply have to get the right policy. But I think in the mindset, people are talking only of alcohol. I worry because that means more sugar cane, which is already subsidized. Then you use most of the water and then you subsidize the ethanol out of it even more. So we have to take a realistic view and a huge and I don't see any movement in this direction in the last 3-4 years. So this is the general position.
Thank you so much, sir. I think it is indeed a very nice start to our session where you have outlined all the major issues that is plaguing the sector right now. I thank you. Before I invite Mr. Giri, I will just like to just inform our attendees that they in the chat box they can share the questions and comments that they have, and once post the discussion, we'll come back to these questions and pose them to our panelists. Mr. Giri, the floor is yours.
Oh, thank you, gentlemen. Thank you so much for inviting me. I think I have a small issue that after Guptaji's fiery talk, I'm a little confused as to where I should start with. But anyway, being a old timer, I will go ahead with the formula what you have given. But before I get into, as I called it, my bhashan, I would certainly make a few statements. One, that the 175 gigawatts is not 2022. Now it's been revised to 2023. Just a number. Guptaji absolutely talked about grid. I think a variable intermittent industry like wind or solar can give enough headaches to the grid. So CEA has been coming out with a number of notifications on the grid, and I think RE industry, whether it is solar or wind, I think we need to have grid discipline to bring about grid security. I think that's extremely important. Forget pin corridors and whatnot. That's the third. Sorry, the second. The third is, sir talked so beautifully about manufacturing in India of solar. Unlike solar, under his stewardship, today we have wind of 10 gigawatts manufactured in the country with almost 80% localization. It's really championing the cause of Atmanirbhar Bharat or Make in India clarion call of the Prime Minister. Sir talked about coal plants. I will not get into that, but I was very happy to see this morning there is a draft paper from CEA as to how they want to give even temporary connections for construction, and they are going to phase out the use of electricity by diesel generating sets in the next 5 years. I think these are very beautiful things the government is looking at. Yes, I remember Guptaji have always said that the estimates of supply far exceeds demand, and demand creation I will come in a little while as we finish. Just to go back to a little bit of history for those who are new to the sector or who would like to hear as to what happened from the 90s. Wind energy, because solar was not there at the time, wind energy grew because primarily investment from the private sector using a financial tool of income tax deduction on accelerated depreciation. This perhaps was the biggest driver for the growth of wind. Number two was use of generated power for captive use. Major examples of textile and cement plants were able to future-proof their power costs, which was always rising. Number three, there was a stable state-determined tariff. So they were able to see as to how the IRRs would work, because chartered accountant would say, this is the profit and this is the kind of investment you would have to make, and this is the kind of power we require. So that was a very beautiful formula, it worked. And in between, some of the states who were really wanting to rush into wind energy gave even sales tax benefits. There was very, very friendly wheeling and banking policies. There were group capital where a generator could sell to multiple users with a formula of 26%, 25%. I think that has worked extremely well. And all this happened before the IPPs came in. And once the IPPs came in, Guptaji is fully aware of it, but as a part of the government that they introduced generation-based incentive for those who did not require accelerated depreciation of 50 paise per unit with an upper cap of 1 crore. So in effect, there was a pan-India growth out of 9 wind states, barring Kerala and Telangana, which was not there. About 7 states, there was pan-India growth, and there was a pan-India spread of manufacturing of, wind turbines, and equally supported by a very robust supply chain of over 4,000 vendors. This is where we were. Come 2017, I have no quarrel with anybody. The government decided to go for central procurement with reverse bidding or competitive bidding. And it was a central procurement. They bid out about 20,000 megawatts, about 15,000 megawatts was awarded. And unfortunately, we have only about 3,000 megawatts, which have all been installed so far. So from 2017, I would only say, without passing any remark, there should have been a transition when you moved from feed-in tariff or preferential tariff to competitive bidding, as was done in China. But then we just shut off one tap and opened another tap. With the result, nobody was really prepared. There were small bids, there were rush for orders, there was a pressure on the OEMs, there was a pressure on the IPPs to grab orders. With the result, there were falling tariffs, which have now become non-sustainable. I would even say non-bankable. And between 2017, 4 years in a row, and fifth year running between 2021 to 2022, the addition has been 1.5 gigawatts per annum. We are today standing at 40 gigawatts. We have to do another 20 gigawatts by 2023, and we have to do 100 gigawatts in the next 9 years. As Sir was saying that you require something like 30 gigawatts of solar, even to meet the government target, because government targets were not fixed by me, it was fixed by the government. If you want to do that, you need to do what 10 or 11 gigawatts per annum. And with 1.5 gigawatts in the last 5 years, it's not going to happen. Now, what is the future we need to do? If you really want to get, I'm not getting into the demand supply, the demand part of it. I'll just talk about demand a little later as I finish, because I'm also looking at my watch. The future cannot depend on single procurement or central procurement. You need to find alternate markets. The alternate markets can come from open access or corporate PPAs. Government is shutting off wheeling and banking facilities. For an intermittent product like this, it does require, I'm happy that from the association, we have given a paper to the government on as to how a structure of wheeling and banking can be got, though wheeling and banking are concurrent subjects of the states. We have a huge potential for exports. With the domestic market down, our exports, which were somewhere around 600 million, is now touching 1.3, 1.4 billion. It's just because there is no domestic market. So even when you have a vibrant domestic market, to get 10 gigawatts per annum, we can become really, with the geopolitical changes that are happening, moving away from China to bring India as the destination for manufacture, we can truly become a global manufacturing hub. We also need to look at, with the current procurement of central procurement, the bridge is 50 megawatts. So the entire small retail investments of 1 megawatt, 2 megawatts, 5 megawatts, that has gone for a 6. We have given a paper to the government as to how we are given a schematic diagram, and since we have already given it to the government, I can share it with Mongabe as to how we can get fixed tariff for projects below 50 megawatts, which would be higher than the bidded out tariff, as to how it can be bundled with agencies like NTPC or PTC, who can bundle power. Let's remember only one thing: power has got no color. It is finally what's palatable to the discoms. If you are able to bundle power, and if you are able to give it, and power being a stable source, I'm sure we will not have the issues of intermittency or variabilities. As far as the enablers are concerned, I'll just say, I'll take 2 minutes, just 1 second. As far as enablers are concerned, let's only look at mandating RPO. As far as the future is concerned, I will not get into storage. I will only say we have a huge potential in offshore. We need to decarbonize 3 things. We need to decarbonize the grid. We need to decarbonize the transport industry by bringing electrical vehicles. we need to decarbonize the industry using clean hydrogen through offshore, bringing about clean water, using it, and making it to clean hydrogen. I'll stop with that. If I've exceeded on time, my apologies. Thank you very much for your patience and time.
Thank you, Mr. Gill, for sharing your perspective. In fact, after the two gentlemen have shared their perspectives, I think now is the time for me to invite Ms. Mitra to share her perspective. Over the years, she has closely analyzed the growth of the clean energy sector in the country. Over to you, Ms. Mitra.
Thanks a lot. I'm sitting in the midst of such august and expert company today. It almost feels improper to comment, but I'll try my best to sort of add to the conversation and organize my thoughts and put it in a way that's sort of logical and clear. Let's start with the positives. I think we should always start with the positives. There's no denying that we have made very substantial progress in the last decade on renewables. And our ambition is even higher today with the PM announcing the 450 gigawatt target at the UNGA. And we have huge potential for renewables, over 1,000 gigawatt in wind and solar alone, right? And over this last decade, we've tried to sort of build that ecosystem for the industry. And, Mr. Giri talked about that, the various policy reforms over the years. And it won't be wrong to say that, these policy incentives have driven the demand primarily, whether it was the RPOs or whether it was GBI and accelerated depreciation for wind. In the very beginning, that spurred the investment in wind, and today it's more the transparent bidding, waiving of the interstate transmission charges, the must-run status that's been given to renewables. These have all been very significant drivers. Another significant driver has been the reducing cost of technology, which has brought the cost down sharply over the years. It's not just the competitive bidding aspect in India, but globally also the prices have been falling. Whether it was a bid that SECI did with the 1,200 megawatt of wind solar hybrid plants, which discovered a very low tariff of 2.34 per unit, or in January in 2020, when India held its first RE plus storage auction, where two organizations won the auction. There, although the resultant, sort of peak time tariffs were higher than what is an average coal-fired tariff, but the off-peak was much lower. And overall, one can, definitely, count that as progress. Today, there's more interest in innovative sort of means of power generation as well, whether it's like floating solar or offshore wind. NTPC is expecting to commission a very large, above sort of 400 megawatt floating solar power plant in Telangana. There's also interest in enhancing storage-based capacity and upgrading our grid, which will eventually allow for more RE in the grid. Battery costs have also been falling, and that has also sort of added to the positive environment. Compared to like a decade ago, today a battery pack is almost like 100th of the price, and which could probably get to another half of this price by 2030. And in other forms of technology, one of the speakers spoke before me about, there's also interest in other forms that we should explore, like compressed biogas plants, that around 5,000 plants are to be set up. And then, technologies like hydrogen with the National Hydrogen Mission. So there's a lot of progress that has been made in RE. And if you look at the other side, the competitiveness and profitability of coal has been going down. It's been impacted. It has been like the share of coal-based power has been falling slightly in this last, in this economic slowdown, which was possibly caused due to the recession, but nevertheless, it's a slowdown. And post the pandemic, if this is to sort of continue, one can expect that you could, peak quite early compared to what we had originally predicted in terms of coal power plants, like maybe even before 2030, right? So now coming to the challenges. Now, I feel like there's different sets of challenges, some that are common across different sources of power, and some that are sort of specific to wind or specific to solar, or to say biomass or hydro. So in terms of common challenges, I would say, power system flexibility constraints, of course. We have to build in more demand response, batteries, focus more on, say, other storage mechanisms like pumped hydro. Land is a very common issue across technologies, maybe not so much in some, but at least for wind and solar. And we have essentially bet on two technologies, right? Like one that is seasonal and one that provides power only at certain times in the day. So, and we need like power 24/7. So this is perhaps common to all RE except for, say, biomass and large hydro, where the seasonal nature is sort of less pronounced. So, these kind of teething troubles are sort of expected, and I think can be worked around. If you look specifically at wind, our target for wind is pretty low in comparison to its potential. And like Mr. Giri spoke before me, it was already pretty mature at the time that the solar mission started, for example, because of the AD and GBI incentives. But over time, once competitive bidding sort of came into the picture, suddenly the focus was so much more on larger plants requiring more land, and which sort of also reduced tariffs drastically. So the interest in the sectors from the largest players started going up, and from the smaller players started going down. And the payback period of setting up a plant also increased significantly, right? So we had like 20-30 manufacturers at one point when the solar mission had started, like before that, and now we barely have like a handful which are surviving in the current market. So obviously this is one big challenge. Then other big challenges around curtailment, for example. Although renewables, we have the must-run sort of status, but it operates with a certain power generation curtailment risk. Right? We need more forecasting and scheduling of wind and solar power. We need upgradation of the transmission grid. And we need to think about the health of our distribution agencies. If you talk specifically about solar also, solar has seen something of a slump recently for a variety of reasons, partly because of COVID, because there have been execution costs and delays, but also because certain discoms have had reluctance to sign PPAs and things like that. Then also the basics custom duty that's been sort of imposed on imported solar cells and modules. These are also sort of added to the mix, but like I said, not necessarily a bad thing. We're just building a market and trying to build a manufacturing base alongside. So these kind of teething troubles are sort of inevitable. But I think overall with the solar sector, it has been like that issue in the falling tariffs, right? This bidding, which has sort of made the margins so low now for those who are interested in bidding for the sector. And they show the weak financial health of the distribution companies who are not able to now pay the prices that were promised in PPAs that were signed much before, like in the case of Andhra Pradesh and all the cases that they're finding now. On the manufacturing side also, our capacity is pretty low. We are we're entirely import dependent when it comes to solar. And this is what other speakers spoke about too. And then land is a big issue, which we will probably discuss as a group later. But there is huge potential in certain sectors which hasn't been realized, like say for rooftop solar, right? We're not even like 20% there in the target. We had like a target of 40 gigawatt. And while some technology and financial incentives and policy intensive have helped say the commercial and industrial sectors, but in the residential sector, it's still not, it's still not convinced the market, and it's a variety of sort of split incentives. Even with state system operators, they see obvious risks when it comes to the financial stability of the discoms, or distribution issues when it comes to grid stability, and also the uncertainty in sort of forecasting accurately when you have so many such distributed plants. So there are a lot of issues, and when it comes to land also there's issues. We have to recognize that our existing regime is not entirely just, right? And decarbonization will impact jobs, and it will lead to sort of regional disparities in jobs. Mining and coal belts will have to deal with negative externalities while they are already sort of developmentally impaired. So there are like a lot of issues, and like one of my colleagues puts it very well. He says that RE needs to be not just renewable energy; it needs to be responsible energy, right? Because as a world, we're dealing with all of these disparities, and we're also dealing with climate change issues. So we need to solve both, and so we have no choice at this point. But there are a number of steps we can take going forward. There's a certain study we had done for which is called the economic rate of return. We were trying to assess for different renewable energy technologies, and we applied this framework on different some states in the country, and we realized that the rate of return from these projects, and not just looking at the financial aspect, but looking at the economic, social, environmental effects, and then monetizing them and including them within a certain decision parameter, we realized that it's very different for different regions across the country. So I'm happy to sort of, we have a draft of that report. I'd be happy to share some results from that as well. But way forward, I think it's way forward. We have to be very judicious in the way that we, look at technology, not just solar wind, thinking beyond that. Greater link with this Make in India going forward, which, with wind, we had that. With solar, we haven't had that sort of link with the growth of the manufacturing space. And, other speakers spoke about that before me. So I think there are definitely a lot of positives, and we have to continue to sort of explore these options we have, whether it's technologically or whether it's demand side.
Thank you. Thank you, Ms. Mitra. I must admit that after the take of three of you, my journalistic mind is now teeming with, like, I have so many ideas that I want to explore. And actually now is the perfect time for me to invite my boss and also the managing editor of Conga Bay India, Gopal Warrior. He is somebody who's closely tracked the energy transition of the country from an economy running on fossil fuels just after 1990, and to the economy which is now rapidly adopting clean energy. Gopi, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Mayank. Actually, just before, just preparing for this, I was looking at when is the earliest story that I did on renewable energy, and then I found a clipping from Hindu Business Line dated 1994. I was a young reporter in the Hindu Business Line covering environment from Chennai, and this report was on the wind energy, because those days nobody was talking about solar energy. Wind energy sector, how corporates are picking up wind energy in Tamil Nadu. I mean, I was looking at Tamil Nadu, the sites at Muppandal, Kayathar, etc. So I was talking with industry. So at that time it was 15 megawatts, and on record at that time was a gentleman called Shaktikanta Das, who was the managing director of Tamil Nadu Newsprints, who's now the RBI governor, and whole set of players. So as Mr. Giri said, the biggest incentive at that point of time was the 100% depreciation. In fact, the industry were looking at, companies were looking at even spreading out the investment over years so that they could get the benefit of the income tax depreciation at that point of time. But we were really talking of a very nascent. I mean, though wind was was leading, wind energy was leading, but very nascent industry, because we were making a projection of 800 megawatts over the next 3 years, and at that time, US, which was the leading country, had 1400 megawatts in wind energy. So from that point, to come to a point where we are talking of 100 gigawatts installed capacity, I mean, we have traversed a long path, and lots of changes have happened over the period of time. Part of it was part of the external discussions that we have had, external negotiations we have had on climate change. So good amount of it when after emissions trading started, and there was green diplomacy, and there was investment, the clean development mechanism investment in countries like India. So there was a push towards renewable energy at that time, but more so after Paris, it's not something that's driven by Kyoto, the Kyoto Protocol regime of clean development mechanism, but by our own commitments. So we have really come a long way from that point of time, to 100 gigawatts from 800 megawatts, and to say that we will take it to 175 by 2023, and to take it to 450 by 2030. I mean, it's a path that we have really taken. So now, I mean, now we have reached a stage. I mean, at least certainly in installed capacity, not so much in generation, but certainly in installed capacity, about 25% of our installed capacity is from renewable sources. So taking it to 30%, our commitment, I mean, we are on the path. So that's the good side that we have been doing. But the point is, I mean, as an environment journalist, as what is our role, and what is it that we can do to move this transition forward, because we have this role of promoting discussions in the public space, and through the public space in the policy space. So our focus is on the is on creating the nuances, understanding the nuances, and this is the first step in that. So I mean, in addition to thanks from Mayank, I mean, thanks to all of you for bringing these nuanced discussions into the process. And this is not the first of our webinars. We're going to have a lot more of these discussions. So the process is to identify the bottlenecks and what can what are the issues, what are the challenges, what are the opportunities, and generate public opinion. But I mean, so the larger picture for us, for the media, for environment journalists, I mean, we do support energy transition, but I mean, we also want to raise, as Apurva raised before me, I mean, raise the issues of concern. I mean, we do not. I mean, we would rather want this transition to happen without some of the legacy issues that have come from the previous regime to come into the renewable sector. I mean, and the most primary is the issue of land, because I mean, according to the CEA figures, 1 megawatt of thermal power requires half a hectare, and solar requires 2.5 hectares. So we are talking of into 5x kind of a requirement of solar. So when we're talking about 450 gigawatts, 1,000 gigawatts, let's do a mental mathematics and how much of land is there, and what are the issues that come. I mean, already the equity issues and those issues. I mean, let us be aware of it, and let us see how we do that with minimum amount of animosities and displacements and pain. The other trend that we are seeing, and that is I mean, as Mr. Giri said, when we started, it was a small player, small megawatt capacity. But now we are seeing, and that in the last 6 months, certainly, I mean, almost all the big names in fossil fuel have moved to renewable sector. Now, does that, how does that negate the, because one of the beauty of the idea of renewable energy was the decentralization. I mean, I could generate the solar, I mean, the energy I needed for myself over my rooftop. So how is that affecting the decentralized nature? And that's a very, very critical issue to be thought of in terms of equity of distribution and energy security, etc. So that's the second issue that we need to think of in future. And the third one is this is the one of the supply chains, the clean supply chains. I mean, what are the cost? What are the cradle to grave cost of some of these? I mean, these we are still lost in the euphoria of renewable energy, but we haven't gone through the mathematics of what are the cradle to grave costs. I mean, are we net poorer environmentally in some of these? So that those assessments have to be sort of done for everything like batteries, panels, everything, and the social support. I mean, despite all that you say about the traditional fossil fuel industry like mining, it had a certain amount of social support in terms of healthcare for workers, etc. I mean, those issues, how does that play out in the sunrise sector? And how do you deal with state level, national to state level gaps in policy? So this would be the third. And actually very important, and I'll close with this. There's also, at the larger picture, at the macro level, there's also a bit of policy bipolarity. How do you deal with that? I mean, on one level, you have the government promoting renewable energy, and at the other, after the first lockdown was over, when the policy package, economic policy package was announced, there was support for renewed support for coal and renewed support for the mining industry. So how do you deal with at one level the policy bipolarity? So these are some of the issues that sort of engage us as journalists. And thank you. I mean, such a pleasure to have all of you on Mongabay's panel discussion. Back to you, Mayank.
Thank you, Gopi. Thank you so much. Mr. Gupta, I'll yes, please.
Just one question. I think Gopi has raised many issues. I think since you are going to have a series of webinars, you have to identify each issue, and each issue has to be discussed in depth to understand where the real challenges are. Discom financial health is a challenge. How does it affect other things? We are in a vicious circle of large companies, low tariffs, don't know the financials about it. You know, many issues come up like this. Rooftop, you want decentralized, Discom won't pay because the higher paying tariff is going away. You know,
so we intend to take all these issues one by one.
Yeah, each has to be dissected in detail. Each has to be dissected in detail. Then you will get a clear idea.
In fact, I'll just take this moment to give this comment that, you know, during the issues that have been raised during this discussion, whether it is land, whether it is the health of the Discoms, whether it is the rights of the workers involved, whether it is the impact of so-called clean energy projects on the environment, wildlife, all these issues we also faced while covering these issues on the ground. Our reporters, people who work for us, and the team, when we were like working on the ground covering these issues, we faced questions. We saw these issues playing out on the ground. So in fact, this takes me to the second part of the webinar now, where we'll have some questions based on our experience and also this discussion. I wanted to start with the one point that everyone, all the panelists have spoken about. Basically, that when we talk about India's renewable energy program, whether we say 175, whether we say 450 gigawatt, no matter what the target we look at, there's increasingly this debate over the impact of large-scale projects, because anyways, rooftop is not on anybody's radar per se. So there's increasingly we're looking at large-scale projects, and these large-scale projects, you know, require huge tracts of land, and which is now resulting in conflicts, whether it is about the environment or the communities. We have the Supreme Court case in Rajasthan, we have cases in Assam, we have cases across India, and people are increasingly objecting to it. In fact, while working on these stories, we saw about mega parks coming in ecologically sensitive areas, whether it is Gujarat, Rajasthan, Maharashtra, everywhere. So while working and while pursuing this clean energy transition, how do we look at these issues? How are the stakeholders going to tackle these issues? Anybody who wants to take that?
You want us to answer?
Yeah, I'm just opening up.
I think the problem that has become is we want the lowest possible tariff. The lowest possible tariff will only come if there are large plants. And by the way, land is not the only problem. This requires a huge amount of money, and therefore only few players can come in. How Mr. Giri mentioned about wind having tariffs which have now become not sort of bankable. I think this is the solar issue. People quote many of the solar projects which have 2 rupees and 2 rupees 20 paisa as examples of how low tariff can go. Those are wrong examples, because then you tend to benchmark the tariff to those particular. Those are, in my view, either very, very special projects where somebody has invested money without seeking that return. I mean, people have to, and you people maybe like to examine what are the returns in the tariffs that have been quoted in the last 2-3 years. Are they viable returns, or is it an entry-making proposition? So you have to be concerned with this. Now, if I were to go dispersed, and if there were farmers or other local people doing 1 megawatt, 2 megawatt, land would not be such a big problem. But the tariff would be a little higher, although the transmission cost has been saved. But you are getting the benefit of somebody at the lower level earning that income. So we have to facilitate that. And always, production of the power at the lower end of the grid is going to help the grid. It is not going to worsen the situation. And I often say that all the electricity of solar that I produce in, say, Rajasthan or Gujarat or Kutch, and if I have to transfer it for the evening supply in Bihar, when the storage will have come, it is not serving a logical purpose. I must produce where I can consume. And solar provides this opportunity. So we have to look at all the various ways that this can be done best. You know, in the solar mission, there was a one particular component of 1 megawatt power plants for 100 megawatt. That has never been discussed. I've never seen any analysis of that. What happened to that? I mean, that was an, we had, obviously tariff at that time was higher, but it was an experiment. It was to build ecosystems. It was to learn. And eventually we had thought such plants all across the country would come up, and I can have 100 gigawatt of such plants all across the country, but nobody's talking about it. And it is imperative that we talk about it, how it can be done, how the cost can be reduced, how people can be trained to do it, how finance can come to help them. All these things I think are very, very important. We tend only to discuss big targets and in larger general terms. And by the way, the government target is to have coal for double the capacity of coal, as also these big renewable energy target. Now both, we were successful in both. You can imagine what would happen.
Mayank, if I may just add to
Yes,
what
yeah.
Deepak said and pertinent to land, I would say, unlike solar, we will pat our backs that land is on, wind energy is on footprint basis. So we don't require large tracts of land once it is microsited. Agriculture can coexist with wind energy, as seen in many countries abroad, and Denmark being one of the biggest examples. But I think the serious issue on land is not availability of land as far as wind is concerned. I think it is the ROW issues of transmission. Today, it's anarchism, it's dadagiri. If your project costs 7 crores, by the time you complete a transmission line of 30, 40 kilometers, because there is that disconnect, however much I take my hats off to the clean corridor, the larger distance you travel, bigger is the loss, and the ROW issues. Can you imagine, Deepak sir, that one pole by an unrelated person in an open ground could be as high as 10 lakhs per pole? Now, something needs to be done. We are not law enforcers. You have the Central Telegraphic Act where they say that as per the Electricity Central Telegraph Act of 61 or 62 or whatever, you should have a right of way of putting up your telegraphic line, power line. That doesn't happen. Plus, I would say that even on grid, if there is a better planning between PGCL, POSACO, CA, and the industry, the distance could be cut down much. The third would be there is so much of unutilized STU, which can be corrected as deemed STU, deemed CTU, where your grid costs can come down. And finally, of course, I remember, I think Apurva talked about end of life. We have age-old plants like the vintage coal plants, which requires repowering. So I think land is a finite source, and the old turbines are sitting on the best of land. Unfortunately, government has not come out with a friendly policy on repowering. Repowering alone can open up about 3,000 megawatts, whose generation could have a multiplier effect of 2 or 2.5. I think this is a great opportunity, and we need to work on it. And land is perhaps one of the biggest issues, and connected issue is the ROW issue and the grid issues.
Thank you.
Just wanted to sort of jump in with my reflections as well. Completely agree with everything that the other speakers have mentioned. Land acquisition is a country projects, and also given the sort of poorly maintained land records and the understanding of what is wasteland and what is productive and what's not, which has sort of led to this conflict with local communities. Conflicts with these long-time users who don't have legal titles yet use the land, which has been classified as wasteland by the government. Now with private land, these rules are a little more clear. And there's a lot of, there's laws that govern the rights of the local communities when it comes to private land. But with public land, it's not very clear. So that's where this, sort of pile up of court cases, because there are communities that are using those lands productively, although they are called wastelands, right? But, compared to coal and other sort of forms of traditional sources of energy, the issue in RE is much less complicated, like Mr. Giri mentioned, because you can choose where to locate your plants. You don't have to mine in a particular state and set up all the infrastructure to transport the coal and minimize the transport and hence the cost. You can locate plants in a more sort of distributed pattern and base these decisions on various sort of economic, social, and environmental criteria, right? You can actually minimize the total land use also by investing in things like offshore wind or rooftop solar that was also mentioned. But we need to have clear sort of criteria for rating these project or potential sites essentially. Mr. Gopi also spoke about the need to assess cradle to grave costs. At our side, for certain technologies, we have looked at this sort of entire supply chain. But when it comes to renewable energy, we've tried to sort of assess the environmental, social costs across specific technologies. When developers essentially look to invest in a certain area, they traditionally just look at the financial impact of their investment. But from the state side, you need to look at the entire sort of the cost to economy, right? So compared to the project rate of return, there's there's another term which is the economic rate of return. Which looks into account, takes into account the impact on land, water, the environment, on air pollution and all of that, and health essentially. And we saw that when we applied this framework on different locations or different states within the country, the results are very different. So for example, we found that in Maharashtra, the returns, the economic rate of return, which is taking into account all the social and environmental and economic impacts, not all of them, the ones that we could quantify within this study, we saw that wind power was given the highest returns for Maharashtra. Similarly, in Jharkhand, we saw that solar PV was giving us greater returns. And in Assam, it was small hydro, given the abundance of water there. So we find that a lot of these local factors like prevailing population patterns, which determine how air pollution impacts you, or the water scarcity issues. For example, in Maharashtra, the cost of when we tried to monetize water, we found that the cost was highest there, given the urban issues. The land use patterns, and even the weather conditions, they all play such an essential role in driving this estimate of what is the overall return from this economic and social perspective. So in concluding, I wanted to say that we should try to utilize land based on what works best for a specific region. It can't be a one size fits all state. Like, it's not that every state has to do everything the exact same way or follow one another. I think we need to understand what works best for a certain state. And we also need more information on site identification, which takes into account all of these factors that can inform developers or inform a strategy within a state.
Thank you. Thank you so much to all the panelists for taking up this question head on. In fact, that actually brings me, the comments actually bring me to the second question, which we have repeatedly encountered during our stories while we are trying to document the issues. One is basically about the finance. A lot of projects and the industry, when I speak to people or when I speak to a lot of stakeholders involved, the question of finance, that who is going to actually finance these projects, repeatedly comes up. That is one. And also the repeated flip-flops. So for example, if as an industry, as a developer, if I'm putting my money in a project, what happens when the states involved or the other stakeholders involved repeatedly changes the policy, or like whether it is about the transmission issues or whether it is about canceling PPAs? How all of you, like, if anybody wants to take this question, how do you look at this paradox? Sir, you're on mute.
Tell you the problem. For example, a few days back, the GST Council has increased the GST from 5% to 12% on solar. So many things. Why it has done so, nobody has a clue. We represented to them, but we never got any response. Now, this will increase the cost of existing projects. because it is applicable immediately. What does the developer do? Now, should he go for change in law clause? If he does, the DISCOM won't agree. Then it will go to the regulator who won't agree. Then you go to court. Somebody laughingly told me that companies now, the most important part of their office is the legal cell, because
Okay.
every time they have to keep going. ड्यूटी बढ़ गई, 5% से कस्टम ड्यूटी आ गई, फिर वो दूसरी वाली ड्यूटी आ गई, फिर वो कुछ ट्रांसमिशन का बदल गया, फिर समथिंग हैपेंड, यू नो. सो these are hidden costs and hidden challenges. You can't have this thing happening. So I mean, this is an issue. Actually, you people can list it out and document it, where all this is happening all the time. No, even regular contracts are now being cancelled. I mean, somebody
Yeah,
talked of
we are trying our best to document it.
yeah, yeah. It's really worth documenting, because this is not how you promote solar. How can you do? And I wonder what happens to the returns of the companies which have been based on a certain assessment and a PPA. Then in comes something else suddenly, and you are, you know. Rajasthan, the Madhya Pradesh government cancelled a PPA of a 200, 300 megawatt project when the construction was going on. So what happens? So these are, nobody talks about these issues, but you cannot ignore them. You cannot ignore them.
I totally endorse with Gupta Sahab. I think on the 5% to 12%, you can call it change in law, but then I have just one nasty comment to make. Very, very, and rightly so. And I know I'm completely aggrieved by it. We always talk about the financial health of the DISCOMs. What has the DISCOM done in reducing tariff to the final consumer? In my view, renewable energy industry, be it solar or wind, we are subsidizing an inefficient DISCOM. I think that's what we are doing, and we have got itself into a gridlock where tariffs have fallen. They are not sustainable, and I can quote, because I was a party to it, in a presentation that was made by SECI in ministry in MNRE. They made a presentation that for a sustainable tariff of having a PLF of X, which was somewhere around 32, 33%, the tariff should be in the region of 3 rupees 46 paisa. If somebody has done their Excel sheet of 346 and we are today as low as 244, and government thinks that this tariff should come down as low as 2 rupees, everything is free. It's only an equipment which you buy. And then people today ask, what's in the turbine after all? Just a blade and a tower and some generator, some gearbox. I think we are in serious capital goods business. And I'm afraid targets are being put up without seriousness. The must-win status we are talking about, I do not want to quote any state, but there has been instances where we have proved that it was done for commercial reasons. If I'm going to fight with the guys who are producing state-run coal plants, and if I'm given a poor cousin treatment, I think it's not fair. And everything falls on the final poor generator. I think if you do this, the generator is going to run away. We are going to have a lot of equipment manufacturers. And though it's not part of Mayank's thing, let's look at, you're talking about climate change, global warming. Just look at even the kind of employment that's being provided, the positive impact on the rural economy we are bringing about. Let's say, as far as wind is concerned, we are a zero water industry. I don't think any of these things are being given any kind of credit at all. We're just being pushed to say, turbine costs are high, reduce karo, kahan reduce karenge? I think, it's a serious matter, and I'm sure, Maya, I think probably would have to get technologies and cost of turbine where we are saying we produce the lowest cost in the world to reduce it further. You want to compromise on the quality? I'll stop at that.
Thank you. Thank you so much.
Just if there's time, I'd just also
Sure,
like
sure.
to reflect.
Go ahead, Apurva.
Thanks. So I know I completely agree with the speakers. If you talk about issues faced by developers, discoms going back on PPAs is a major issue. The tax uncertainty, whether it's GST or the new import tax, these are all sort of added uncertainties, right? And industry associations are raising objections on, curtailment, alleging that some of the old, more expensive power plants are being curtailed compared to, the newer ones where the PPA, the tariff values are much lower. That's what Mr. Giri was speaking about. And it's not always because of grid stabilization they're alleging, because they're often not sort of provided a very solid reason, right? But also, if you look at it from the financial institution side, IREDA has huge outstanding loans, right? And some of them are now sort of turning into non-performing assets. So, the comprehensive sort of understanding of the reasons responsible for why this is happening, and how to critically analyze projects or investments better. I think this is also a need when it comes to the finance side of things. On the sort of positive side, I think we have innovative financing mechanisms to look for. While CDM has sort of driven the growth in the wind sector, and we don't have that anymore. Like the prices are like full-time, like on floor low. And so obviously developers can't depend on the prices from carbon markets specifically, but with the green bond market, for example, India entered the green bond market with Yes Bank had issued like the first green bond for financing renewable and clean energy, and that did finance certain wind and solar plants. And eventually this has sort of expanded to several types of companies who have been interested in public sector undertakings and state-owned banks and others, right? One recent study also says that that renewable energy developers have in India have issued green bonds worth almost 26,000 crores, right, in this first half of 2021, which is also a record, right? And but although two particular organizations have account for the majority of the issuances by value, so I think here also I think we have to get more sort of players interested in these innovative markets, and but we have to think more collectively about how we can set up these markets, how we can make use of these markets, how we can make use of international finance as well. What should be our need or ask to the international community, even as part of the climate regime. So yeah, just a few reflections I wanted to share.
Thank you, Ms. Mitra. So what I'm going to do now, because we are running against the time, what I'm going to do, I'm going to club the questions that I have with the questions that our listeners have sent to us. So I have a couple of them. I'll request every one of you to just keep your answers a little brief. You have been doing that, just reiterating that. So the first thing that I wanted to understand from any one of you who wants to take that question, this is from Mr. Ramesh Vaidya and Vishnu Prabhu. Mr. Vishnu Prabhu, that they're asking the role of hydropower in maintaining the flexibility in the grid, and also the role of biomass as we move along, as we look at increasing the renewable installation.
I replied to this question. There is a need to study the potential of pump storage in the country, and whatever is the potential, we should try to maximize our construction for that. There are a lot of environmental problems now with large hydro problems. We have to take that into account. And I already said that biomass is a neglected area. Now, biomass, I think, cannot be so much for electricity as much as for biogas. So it will have a greater impact on the mobility sector. The cost of production of electricity from biomass is very high. That cannot be supported. Even now, there is a talk of, from the stubble in Punjab to make pellets and to take them into NCT area thermal plants. But there's a huge cost to those pellets to be transported and used elsewhere. Now nobody has talked of this cost. So we have to be very careful how we use biomass, and there is a huge potential which must be urban waste. I mean, it can be fully utilized. So those are the two answers, my answers.
Thank you, Mr. Gupta. Anyone else who wants to take this up?
Yeah, I can
Sure,
quickly
sure.
reflect.
Please.
So if you just look at the sort of the RE plus storage auction that was held, right? Like there were two companies that basically won it. One of those companies is looking at pumped hydro as the storage mechanism. And like I mentioned before, you know, the peak power cost and the non-peak power cost, they're very different. But at the same time, it's not, I mean, it's not exorbitantly different, right? So one can say that you have parity in one way, but maybe not in terms of peak power supply. But the fact that a organization would win the auction based on pumped power shows that there is, you know, the economics is strong. It's not necessarily very exorbitant, right? But if you talk about biomass, I feel like I agree with Mr. Gupta, you know, what he mentioned in terms of the cost, but also the availability of biomass. You know, with a lot of these power plants that are in Punjab and Haryana and that side, there was already a crunch when it came to biomass availability. You know, in all of our CDM projects where we were looking at, you know, the projects that participated in the carbon market at that time as part of the clean development mechanism, there was a certain constraint. We had to demonstrate that there is an excess of biomass in the particular region where that power plant is to be set up or has been set up. And about like there's a 25% availability, excess availability. And we were finding that hard to do even then, because there was little, so many biomass-based power plants had come on at that time that there was a crunch when it came to supply of rice husk and other things. So so I don't necessarily see this as a very long-term, very promising technology, something that we can expand the way that we can expand wind and solar. So we should, you know, that's something to keep in mind, you know, when it comes to that.
Thank you, Ms. Mitra. We have a question from Mr. Soumya Datta. I hope it's Mr. Soumya Datta. And basically, the question is that, do you think, it's for all the panelists, anyone who wants to take this up, that do you think that schemes like KUSUM are not being pushed enough, especially keeping in context of the rural economies? Do you think that we need to promote it more aggressively? Anybody wants to have a quick take on that?
I already said that we should. I already said we should. I am saying the priority must be to convert all electric pumps to solar. It will be a revolutionary change. And then smaller plants in the rural areas. Even Mr. Giri mentioned that, you know, you can have agriculture below the wind plants. But now there's a lot of experimentation being done of agriculture below the solar. Now we only have to find successful models. But if we only look for the lowest possible tariff, then this is not going to happen. Therefore, we must give a cost to some of the positive externalities. If a farmer's income increases, if I'm able to have greater agricultural production, if I'm able to create employment in rural areas, these are all gains. So it is not a simple matter. It's a complex matter, but we have to do the models. We have to make pilots and find a possible solution to this. So KUSUM should be intensified and maybe tweaked a little bit here and there in order to do this.
Guptaji, to add to what you said about the KUSUM project, though of course I'm not involved because I'm not in solar, but the recent announcement was from the Chhattisgarh government, where they have declared a tariff of 3 rupees 16 paise. I think that's a very positive thing to encourage the KUSUM project.
Thank you. Yes, please go.
Yeah, I mean, basically, I mean, from what we have been hearing, I mean, a tariff, very push down tariff, is not self-sustaining for the industry. But also the reality tariff I mean, lower tariff means growth for in terms of numbers. So I mean, taking both this in mind, I mean, would there be a possibility of like how how EU practices organic agriculture versus regular agriculture. I mean, higher tariff for boutique projects. I mean, where all the other factors are taken care of, and maybe lower tariff for the mass projects. So is that something that can be worked into to make this possible?
That has to happen. There is no fixed tariff in any case. So that has to happen. You see, in our time, we tried very hard to push solar mini grids. But that time, the cost of solar was very high. The cost of batteries was very high. We are shouting from the rooftop that both have declined. So the cost of supply from solar to for mini grids must have declined substantially, while the cost of electricity supply with the transmission cost has only increased. So it should have become more viable. So we should see what are the ways of making it more viable. I mean, we are talking here of millions and millions of villages and millions of pumps. Look at the scale. I can have 100 gigawatt in large plants of 2000 megawatt each. Or I can have 20 million solar pumps. I can have 20 million solar grids. I can have 20 million 1 megawatt, 100 million 1 megawatt plants. Now examine, and I think it will be worthwhile for you to examine the economic benefits or costs of both and make a case. And a small thing Apurva had mentioned earlier about curtailment in those where higher power, higher cost projects. Certainly, the major portion of the curtailment is for such projects, but it provides a cautionary tale. If for battery and storage and hydrogen, etc., I go very fast, I will have higher costs. Will there be discoms, etc., going back on the commitments made now for the higher costs? Should I therefore incur higher costs? These are existential questions. And that is why I am saying first consolidate. Don't go for big projects at higher costs, because nobody is going to pay for them later on.
Thank you, Mr. Gupta. I just have a couple of quick questions before we close the session. One, I wanted to understand, there's a lot of, when we are talking about such huge targets, we are also talking about thousands of wind turbines. We are talking about millions of solar panels. What happens to the waste coming from the renewable sector? Is there a policy that we have right now? What do we do about
it? This is a very urgent issue which requires immediately a policy for proper disposal and management. And the problem is only going to increase in a very big way. So it requires an urgent consideration and to make a policy of waste. Just as electronic waste is there, so there should be a policy for this waste.
Thank you, Mr. Gupta. Mr. Giri,
I would say that for end of life waste is one issue. I don't think we have a proper policy even for decommissioning. I think that's the first step we need to take. I think, of course, again, talking about wind, end of life, scrapping of turbines, I think the biggest issue we have is only on thermoset large blades, which could be cut up and put into a cement clinker, which ACC is working on. It could be used as road dividers. It could be used for water breaking as dredging seawater, and all the other metals could be recycled. And I'm happy to say that Aditya Birla Group is working on a particular epoxy resin, where at the end of it, you could separate the glass and the resin. And I think it's the issues on wind, I think, are far simpler, but I'm afraid on the solar, there are huge challenges. As far as the e-waste is concerned, I think it's a considerable worry.
Just from your experience, Mr. Giri, like wind power sector is an old one in India. Are there any landfills, like how are they being disposed right now, if any has been disposed so far? Going by your experience, if you have any anecdote to share.
Sorry, say that again.
So going by your experience, the wind sector is certainly older than the solar one in India.
Yes.
Have you come across, do you have any example or any instance to share where wind turbines or wind blades were disposed properly, or like they were disposed in landfills How has been the experience so far in the country?
Repowering has hardly happened, and the old turbines are continuing to work. I don't think it has been addressed so far. No.
Okay, perfect. That takes me to the last question that I wanted to pose to all of you. While working on these stories, one question that intrigued all of us, the whole team, and a lot of contributors working on the ground was the rights of the workers involved in the whole renewable energy ecosystem. Compared to coal, where we have unions, where we have bodies to ensure the rights of the workers involved, is there a space like, because if you see the US elections last year, Joe Biden, while campaigning, talked about encouraging the formation of unions, clean energy unions in US. Do you think that is a possibility? Do you think that there is a space for such a thing in India? Because we have millions of people directly and indirectly involved in the fossil fuel energy based ecosystem. What happens to people when we're talking about millions of jobs in renewable energy? What happens to this section?
I would only answer this, that we don't have the issue of, it's not a coal industry, it's not an asbestos industry, it is not a silica based industry. So I think we are working at a cleaner space, and I'm very happy to say that at least as far as manufacturing is concerned, and the projects are concerned by MNCs, I think health and welfare and the kind of CSR activities that are carried by the manufacturing fraternity of wind OEMs, I think it's an exemplary thing, and I think a lot of positives have happened. Setting up welfare centers, health centers, primary education, creation of creche. I think there has been a tremendous push. Apart from, of course, project work where a lot of contract laborers are being taken, I think it continues to give them seasonal employment whenever the projects come up. Green unions and so on, I think it's too early, too early to comment on.
Anyone else who wants to take that up? Ms. Mitra, Mr. Gupta?
Sure.
I don't know. I think it's a very dispersed project type of industry, even more so than the real estate. I think companies have to follow their own rules to, which in the general way look after the conditions of labor. But when we look at labor issues, I think our concern now at the moment must be much greater. And really something which deserves attention is what is going to happen to coal mines which will close. What is going to happen to the workers there? This issue is not being talked about, but this will become a very, people say close plants and close mines, but the thousands of people will be involved. So this is an issue which,
I'm happy to tell you, sir, that we have been trying, like from the last 1 year, we have
huh?
been trying, we have repeatedly written about it. And
Uh-huh.
we have gone to several experts, we have gone talk to several bodies. We have been repeatedly trying to raise this issue, that what happens to the
Yeah,
transition of those
but
people involved.
good, but in the general sort of media, we don't hear anything about it. I think this is an
I
issue
understand.
which is going to cause social distress. So we have to find a solution to this.
Thank you.
Just wanted to add here that the types of jobs that will be needed across the sector are quite different, and the skills are also quite different. We had worked on a particular report in WRI India that I can share with you later, which talks about not just the quantity of job, but also the quality of jobs, particularly from solar. So we need to understand worker concerns and also understand this contractual nature of the work, where a lot of labor is employed in the construction stage, but they don't have any sort of income or security beyond that. And we end up only talking about coal and the impact on the coal sector. And we talk about coal to RE, that transition directly, which is not necessarily the best option for every region, right? Perhaps even a diversification of jobs from coal. It doesn't have to just go, somebody doesn't just have to go from coal, the coal sector to RE in terms of, where they can find employment, but skilling can be more diverse so that they can find employment in, diverse areas. But I definitely think that we need to have more focus on this. On the previous point on recycling also, just very quickly, I wanted to mention that, we have to understand that whether it's enhancing manufacturing and aligning with the Make in India, India has to sort of negotiate these global supply chain issues, right? There are geopolitical issues and mining issues, and we have to sort of we are trying to sort of actively sort of secure that supply chain across the world, right? There are certain countries which have the upper hand, and what are some of the challenges? We're still sort of grappling with that. It's all very new. But whether it is in enhancing solar manufacturing or setting up gigafactories for, say, storage, there are important minerals like lithium, copper, which are real sort of constraints, right? It's even holding the automobile industry hostage. The other day we were speaking to the head of ACMA, who said that even in the traditional auto industry, the stricter sort of emission norms are necessitating some of these minerals which are in short supply. So reuse and circularity, I think they're both very important. They will reduce our dependence on imports and mining. Also demand aggregation, I think, and even recycling could be aggregated across industry and transport. And I think we'll be able to, with the hydrogen mission, for example, the idea that they're coming up with is that, you aggregate demand, not just from transport, but from different industries like refinery and fertilizer as well. So if we should be able to do that, even the recycling ecosystem has to be built in a more sort of holistic way. I feel like I think we'll be able to. We have done that in the past with a lot of technologies that have come up, and these constraints on, say, lithium and copper. These constraints are more sort of valid today. So I think the recycling market is yet to be set up, but I think I think if we focus on that, we'd be able to build that capacity as well.
Mayank, if I may, Mayank, yeah. I think just to take on the issue of the social sector transition. I mean, and Mayank has been covering. Mayank has been leading a reporting project covering. We have covered a lot of stories on that. So we really nobody's talking about moving from fossil fuel to the renewable energy sector. I mean, that kind of movement of labor is perhaps skill requirements are different and may not happen. But the point is, how do you transition people in the coal sector into other areas where they can move with the least amount of pain, social pain and economic pain. So that's one side of the story. The other side is, I mean, and I think Mr. Gupta did say exactly this. I mean, the point is, I mean, all the ills you can put on the coal sector, fine, but then the point is, it is an organized sector, and it's also politically significant. I mean, nobody can, no parliamentarian coming from a coal-rich area can say, I mean, can deny workers' rights or whatever it is. But here you're talking of an organized sector with a lot of manpower, comparing it to almost a decentralized, unorganized sector. I mean, almost. I mean, you're talking of the manpower required to set up a megawatt of wind energy or a megawatt of solar energy is much less than what is required in the coal sector. So then it starts behaving more like an unorganized sector. So then, I mean, we can say that the independent companies are, individual companies are taking care of these issues, but then will the larger institutional mechanisms disappear? I mean, if they disappear, how can we bring the larger institutional mechanisms into play? I think that's what Mayank was raising. I mean, if somebody would want to say something on that.
I have just one thing more to add, that transition from coal working to renewable, I don't think I'll even attempt that, but I'm happy that both for wind as well as for solar, and more for solar, the government program on Vayu Mitra and Surya Mitra, where skilling is going on, and we as an association have partaken in setting up syllabus for ITIs and diploma in skill development for green jobs. And I'm sure, as we have these huge targets going up, employment or a career opportunity in wind and solar, I think is going to be the future. I don't think we require the BEs. I think we require people who can work on the ground and work up. And I'm sure this is going to be a big initiative taken by MNRE, and I'm sure Deepak ji has thought of it, and the legacy is continuing down.
Thank you so much, everyone. I'm sure like everyone who has attended the program has benefited from the perspective while discussing the challenges and the prospects for the clean energy sector of India. I in fact hope that all the stakeholders involved who are connected to us in any of the possible way can can find answers to all the issues that we have been raising and industry has been raising along to the government. We intend to carry forward these discussions and a lot of ideas that came up during this program today in the webinars ahead. In fact, I will encourage people who are still attending the webinar to put their point across or share. We have you may soon have see a poll in the chat box, and you can share the ideas about the webinars that we can hold. The recording of this meeting will also be available on YouTube for anybody who wants to have a look. And I just wanted to express my thanks to all of you. And here is the poll. So in fact, we plan to organize the next webinar towards the end of October. And I will encourage everyone to follow us on social media and sign up for the newsletter so that we can keep you informed about our clean energy series. And just before we break, just before we close the session, I just want to make a small announcement that very soon MongoDB India is also going to launch a series of podcasts to discuss the country's clean energy transition. I hope to keep all in loop and put out more information on this. Thank you, everyone. Thank you so much for your time and patience. It was a pleasure to have you all. And indeed, I believe I have a lot of ideas to pursue, a lot more stories on this subject. Thank you so much. Have a good day. Have a good evening.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you, sir. Jai Hind.